Hey guys, welcome to Karenology. You won't believe how far some people will go to cause trouble. The first night the blinding light hit my bedroom window, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe my neighbor Tom had just installed a new security light and hadn't realized it was aimed directly at my house. But when I walked outside in my pajamas and knocked on his door, he barely cracked it open, smirked, and said, "Oh, that? Just making sure my property is well lit." Then he shut the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, the cold concrete under my bare feet making me shiver, but not as much as the sheer audacity of what he had just done. The brightness was unbearable, flooding my entire bedroom with artificial daylight. My alarm clock read 2:17 a.m. I was wide awake, and from the way my wife groaned and rolled over, so was she. "Just ignore it," she muttered, pulling a pillow over her head. But I knew better. This wasn't just a security light. This was war. Tom had always been difficult. When we moved in 5 years ago, he had been relatively neutral, neither friendly nor hostile. We exchanged the occasional nod while mowing our lawns, maybe a stiff greeting at the mailbox. But things changed when I cut down the massive oak tree in my backyard last month. It had been old, half-rotten, and dangerously close to toppling over during the next big storm. It was my property, my decision. What I hadn't realized was that, for Tom, that tree had been his privacy shield. Now, with the tree gone, the view from my backyard led directly to his living room windows. Apparently, he hated that. At first, he made passive-aggressive comments. "Sure is bright back there now, huh? Guess we can see right into each other's homes." I thought it was just small talk. Then the SpotLight appeared. I called the non-emergency police line in the morning. "Sir, there's not much we can do if he's lighting his own property," the officer told me. "It's a common dispute, but as long as it's not violating any city ordinances, he's within his rights." When I asked about light pollution laws, the officer sighed and told me I'd have to take it up with the city council. I hung up, already knowing how that would go. Bureaucracy moved slower than molasses in winter. The second night, the light was even brighter. I could see the edges of my blackout curtains glowing, as if a UFO had landed outside my window. I didn't go over there again. I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. Instead, I spent half the night on my laptop researching light reflection angles and high-grade mirrors. If he wanted to play this game, I'd play it better. By the third night, I had ordered 2 large industrial-grade mirrors online. It would take a few days for them to arrive, but I had a plan. In the meantime, I experimented with different ways to block out the light. I tacked blankets over the curtains, wore a sleep mask, even moved to the guest room on the opposite side of the house. But nothing helped. The knowledge that the light was there, that it was deliberate, ate away at me. I imagined Tom sitting in his house, watching, waiting for my reaction. I refused to give him one. Then the fourth night came, and Tom upped the ante. At exactly 11 p.m., a second floodlight turned on, positioned to hit my patio and backyard. I stepped outside in my slippers, shielding my eyes. The sheer intensity of the glow made it impossible to see the stars. I turned and looked at his house. His silhouette stood at the window, watching me. The moment he realized I saw him, he flicked his hand in a mock salute and disappeared into his house. My fists clenched. This wasn't just about a tree anymore. This was personal. He wanted to make me uncomfortable in my own home. I didn't yell or bang on his door. I didn't call the cops again. I already knew how useless that would be. I simply went back inside, sat at my desk, and finalized my plan. By the time the mirrors arrived, I was ready. 2 6-foot panels, reflective and polished to perfection. That night, under the cover of darkness, I set them up strategically along my property line, angled perfectly. When his floodlights turned on at 11 p.m. sharp, the light bounced back, piercing straight through his own windows. I didn't see him that night, but I imagined his reaction. Maybe he was shielding his eyes. Maybe he was cursing my name. The thought made me smile. This was just the beginning. The moment the first rays of his own floodlight reflected back into his house, I knew I had him. That night, I sat in my darkened living room, watching the way the blinding beams pierced his windows, slicing into the privacy he had once taken for granted. He didn't appear immediately, but I knew he was there. Maybe he was pacing, trying to decide what to do next. Maybe he was staring out from behind his curtains, calculating his next move. Either way, I had made my point. By the time the sun rose, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in days. The tension in my shoulders had eased, and for the first time since this all began, I managed to get a few uninterrupted hours of sleep. But when I stepped outside that morning, I saw that Tom wasn't backing down. He was already outside, tinkering with something on his porch. A third floodlight. Bigger, brighter, angled just slightly differently so that it evaded my mirrors. My jaw clenched. This man wasn't just stubborn, he was obsessive. I nodded at him in acknowledgement, half expecting him to gloat. Instead, he gave me a slow smile, the kind that sent a warning straight through my gut. He wanted to see how far I was willing to go. Fine. I could play that game. That evening, I adjusted my mirrors, carefully recalibrating their positions to reflect his new addition. The moment his floodlights flickered on, I was ready. The light bounced back at him just as perfectly as before, and I could only imagine the frustration curdling in his gut. An hour later, I heard the first knock on my door. Not a frantic banging, but deliberate, controlled. I let him knock twice more before opening. Tom stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes glinting in the dim porch light. "Seems we've got a bit of a situation here," he said, voice smooth like he was discussing the weather. "Seems so," I replied, leaning against the doorframe. "You gonna turn those things off?" He exhaled a sharp laugh. "Why would I? It's my property. Just like those mirrors are yours." "Then I guess we're at an impasse." Tom tilted his head slightly, studying me like he was sizing up an opponent in a chess game. "You ever hear of escalating consequences?" he asked. "You threatening me, Tom?" "Not at all, just making conversation." I let the silence stretch between us before finally closing the door in his face. He didn't knock again. But I knew this wasn't over. The next day, a city inspector showed up at my house. Apparently someone had lodged a complaint about unauthorized reflective surfaces causing a neighborhood disturbance. I barely held back my laughter. Tom must have spent all night digging through municipal codes, looking for something to use against me. The inspector, a tired-looking man in his 50s, sighed as he glanced at my mirrors. "Legally, you're fine," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "But I'd advise you to be careful. This kind of thing has a way of spiraling." "You're telling me," I muttered. As the inspector left, I caught movement in Tom's yard. He was watching, waiting for my reaction. That night, a fourth floodlight appeared. I'd had enough. If he wanted a war, I'd give him one. I scoured online forums, digging deep into any legal loophole I could find. And then, finally, I found my answer. A high-powered directional light. A spotlight strong enough to cut through his house like a blade. It was technically legal, and it would be my final move. I ordered it immediately. 2-day shipping. The next night I barely slept, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Tom's house was bathed in the same unbearable brightness as mine, but for once I didn't feel powerless. I had a plan. The second that package arrived, the game would change. But Tom wasn't done yet. The next evening, as I sat in my dimly lit living room, I noticed a new addition to his property. He had mounted yet another floodlight, this time directly on the side of his garage, positioned to hit the upper floor of my house at an even more aggressive angle. My bedroom, my wife's home office, even the hallway leading to the kids' rooms, every window now had an unrelenting beam burning through it. The walls shimmered with sharp, unforgiving light, turning every shadow into something grotesque and exaggerated. My wife, who had been trying to tolerate all of this in silence, finally snapped, "This is insane. We can't live like this." "I know," I muttered, "but I have a solution." "Oh, I bet you do," she said, arms crossed. "And I bet it involves making it worse. I'm not going to lose this fight." She shook her head and walked out of the room, muttering something about moving in with her sister for a while. That stung more than I cared to admit, but I wasn't backing down. The morning my package arrived, I wasted no time setting it up. I spent the entire afternoon mounting my own high-powered directional light at the perfect angle. When the sun went down, I waited, and at precisely 10:45 p.m. I flipped the switch. Tom's house lit up like an airport runway. The concentrated beam of light blasted through his windows with such intensity that I could see his silhouette stumbling backward. He hadn't expected this. His usual cocky posture was gone. Now, he was just a man who had picked a fight he couldn't win. For the first time since this war started, he turned off his floodlights. I watched his house for another hour, waiting to see if he'd retaliate. He didn't. The darkness settled over the neighborhood once more, and I could feel the balance shifting back in my favor. The next morning, I stepped outside to get the newspaper. Tom was already there, standing at the edge of his driveway. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He just nodded once, tight-lipped, and walked back inside. I nodded back, knowing we had reached an understanding. For now. The uneasy truce between Tom and me lasted exactly 48 hours. That's how long it took for him to regroup, reevaluate, and escalate. I first noticed something was off when I stepped outside early in the morning to grab the newspaper. The street was empty, the sky a dull gray just before sunrise, but something about my surroundings felt different. Then I saw it, mounted on Tom's roof. A new floodlight. But this one wasn't just a regular spotlight like before. This one was industrial grade, the kind used for lighting up construction sites at night. He had upped the ante again, and he wasn't even trying to be subtle about it. The metal casing gleamed in the dawn light, and I could already imagine the sheer power it held. I could feel my pulse quicken, my body tensing with that familiar frustration. I knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted me to react. He wanted me to knock on his door, demand an explanation, lose my temper. But I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I took a deep breath, forced myself to turn around, and went back inside. I'd deal with this later. By the time the sun had set, I had nearly convinced myself that I was overreacting. Maybe he hadn't turned it on yet. Maybe he had reconsidered. Maybe, for once, he would let this ridiculous game die out. I was wrong. At exactly 10:30 p.m., the world outside my house exploded in light. Not just the usual blinding white, but something worse. A harsh, burning, yellowish glow flooded through every window facing his property. It wasn't just bright. It was unbearable. The walls in my house shimmered with an ugly hue. The floors cast eerie shadows, and my blackout curtains might as well have been made of tissue paper. I stormed outside, my fists clenched so tight my nails bit into my palms. Tom was already on his porch, leaning against the railing like he had been waiting for me. He grinned. "Little too bright for you, neighbor?" "Are you out of your damn mind?" I snapped. "What the hell is that?" "Oh, just a little upgrade, for security purposes. Can't be too careful these days." I took a slow, deep breath. Losing my temper wouldn't solve this. "Turn it off," he shrugged. "No can do. It's within the legal limits. And as you so kindly reminded me before, what happens on my property is my business." I wanted to throttle him. I could feel my blood boiling, but I held my ground. "This is harassment, Tom. and I swear I will find a way to make you regret it." "Big words! Let's see if you can back them up." I turned on my heel and stormed back inside, slamming the door behind me. I knew I needed a new plan. I spent the next day calling electricians, contractors, even reaching out to the city about potential violations. Nothing. Every answer was the same. He wasn't breaking any laws. But there was one thing he hadn't counted on. I wasn't out of options. That evening, I spent hours online, researching every light-related law I could find. And then I found something. A loophole. A technicality buried in city regulations. Light pollution laws. They weren't strictly enforced, but they existed. And under the right circumstances, with enough pressure, I could make them work in my favor. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the city. Not just one, but multiple. I gathered every piece of evidence I had. Photos, videos, written statements from other neighbors who had grown tired of the excessive brightness. I didn't just make a case. I built a weapon. Then I played my final card. I leaked the story. Local news stations loved petty suburban disputes, especially when they involved something as ridiculous yet relatable as an out-of-control floodlight war. I sent emails, attached the videos, and made sure to frame it as a man terrorizing his neighbor with unbearable light pollution. It didn't take long. By the next evening, a reporter was knocking on my door. "Would you be willing to go on record?" she asked, microphone in hand. I didn't hesitate. Absolutely. The segment aired that night. A dramatic, heavily edited piece featuring my footage of the blinding floodlights. Sound bites of me explaining how my family couldn't sleep, and even a short interview with an annoyed neighbor who had also been affected. The city, now under public scrutiny, had no choice but to investigate. By the following afternoon, an inspector arrived. This time, he wasn't just taking notes, he was issuing warnings. Tom had officially been put on notice. That night, the lights stayed off. I waited, watching, wondering if he was planning something else. But for the first time in weeks, the house was dark. It should have been over, but I knew Tom. And something told me he wasn't done yet. The silence was worse than the light. For days, Tom hadn't retaliated. No floodlights, no smug smirks from his porch, no sudden complaints to the city. It was eerie, unnatural, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. I knew better than to assume he had given up. Tom didn't strike me as the type to accept defeat. He was plotting. And if I had learned anything from our ongoing war, it was that his patience for revenge ran deep. I spent the next few nights on edge, barely sleeping despite the newfound darkness. My body had adapted to being in constant defense mode, anticipating the next strike. I found myself checking the windows at odd hours, watching his house for any signs of movement. It remained quiet. Too quiet. Then, on the fourth night, I found out why. I was jolted awake at 3:12 a.m. by a deafening noise. An alarm blaring from Tom's property. A shrill, high-pitched siren that rattled my windows and sent my heart slamming into my ribs. I bolted upright, my mind sluggish with confusion, then realization. I stumbled out of bed and into the hallway, where my wife stood, half awake and furious. "What the hell is that?" she shouted over the noise. I didn't answer. I already knew. I stormed outside in my sweatpants and t-shirt, shielding my ears as I crossed the yard. Tom was standing on his porch, arms crossed, watching me with a lazy smile. The security alarm mounted on his garage was pulsing like an air raid siren, the kind designed to wake an entire neighborhood. "Turn it off!" I shouted, but my words were nearly drowned out. Tom cupped a hand to his ear. "What's that?" "Can't hear you over my totally legal security system." My hands clenched at my sides. "You can't do this." He shrugged. "Why not?" "You got the city involved with my lights, figured I'd upgrade my security. You can never be too safe." The rage boiled up so fast I almost lost control. I took a step forward, then stopped myself. This was what he wanted. Me losing my temper. giving him a reason to escalate. I wasn't going to play into his hands. Instead, I turned and went back inside, slamming the door behind me. The alarm blared for another 30 minutes before finally cutting off. The next day, I filed a noise complaint. The officer who took my statement looked unimpressed, as if he had better things to do than mediate a suburban war. "It's annoying, sure, but technically he's within his rights," he said. "As long as it's not going off constantly, there's not much we can do." "It went on for 30 minutes at 3 in the morning, I snapped. "That's still not enough for us to act," the officer replied. "If it happens regularly, keep a record and we'll revisit it." I left, frustrated but not surprised. That night, I was prepared for the alarm. I stayed up, waiting, my phone in hand, ready to record. But it never came. Instead, at exactly 11 p.m., every single one of Tom's floodlights switched back on, brighter than ever. Not just aimed at my house, but at my yard, my driveway, even the street. The intensity was blinding, a beacon that could probably be seen from space. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so ridiculously predictable. "He's lost his mind," my wife muttered, standing beside me at the window. "What do we do now?" "We end this," I said. I spent the next 24 hours setting up my final move. I ordered blackout tarps and installed them over every window facing his property. I re-angled my mirrors, doubling their effectiveness, ensuring his own lights would torment him as much as they tormented me. But I wasn't done. That evening, just before his lights were set to turn on, I flipped the switch on my own new system. High-frequency noise emitters, small but powerful, installed discreetly along the property line. They weren't loud, not to human ears. But to someone inside Tom's house, they'd cause an unbearable ringing, a discomforting pressure deep in the ears. At precisely 11:05 p.m., Tom's lights turned on, and then, not 5 minutes later, they turned off again. A shadow moved behind his curtains. I watched, waiting. Then, for the first time in weeks, his house went completely dark. The next morning, I stepped outside to find him waiting. No smirk, no cocky posture, just exhaustion. "Truce?" he asked. I considered him, then nodded. "Truce." And just like that, the war was over. For now. The truce between Tom and me lasted longer than I expected. For a few weeks, our street was bathed in an unnatural calm, a stillness that felt foreign after months of nightly battles. My wife was relieved. The neighbors, who had whispered about our war with a mix of amusement and irritation, seemed to move on. Even I allowed myself to believe for a while that it was truly over. Then the final move came. It started small. The first night, I noticed a flickering light coming from Tom's backyard, an old, rusted-out lantern barely strong enough to illuminate his fence. It wasn't aimed at my house. It wasn't aggressive. If anything, it looked like he had simply forgotten to turn it off. I watched it for a moment, then ignored it. The second night, the lantern had been replaced with something stronger, a soft, golden glow spilling from new fixtures along his back porch. Again, not invasive, not an escalation, but deliberate. By the third night, the glow had expanded, a slow, creeping tide of brightness reclaiming the edges of his property. Spotlights lit his driveway. Garden lamps lined his walkway. Strings of LED lights coiled around the trees like vines. It wasn't just a return to his old ways. It was something new, something worse. The city had ruled against his floodlights. The neighborhood had turned against his alarms. But now, Tom had found the perfect loophole: ambience. By the end of the week, his property looked like a resort. The glow wasn't intrusive in the way the floodlights had been, but it was constant. It seeped through my curtains, settled into the walls of my home, refusing to let the darkness take hold. He had created something that wasn't quite an attack, but wasn't peace either. And worst of all, it was just subtle enough to escape scrutiny. I tried to ignore it. I really did. My wife, already exhausted by the months of fighting, begged me to let it go. The neighbors who had once quietly supported me were starting to lose interest. I was alone in my frustration, so I waited. 2 weeks passed before I found my opening. It came, ironically, in the form of a letter from the Homeowners Association. A complaint had been filed, not against Tom, but against me, the mirrors. The same ones that had bounced his floodlights back into his house had become a neighborhood nuisance. Apparently, they were causing visual discomfort to passing vehicles. The HOA demanded I take them down immediately, or face a hefty fine. I had no proof, but I knew who was behind it. I took the mirrors down that afternoon, but I wasn't done. That night, I did something I never thought I would. I walked across the street, climbed Tom's front steps, and knocked. He answered faster than I expected, as if he had been waiting for me. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Gonna miss those mirrors," he said. "You filed the complaint? Does it matter?" I studied him, trying to decide if I was making a mistake. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer right away. For the first time since our feud began, there was no smugness, no sarcasm in his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "You cut down my tree." I blinked. Of all the things I expected, that wasn't it. That tree wasn't just a tree to me. It was the only thing left from before my wife left. It was our spot. It was... He exhaled sharply. "Doesn't matter now. You took it down and I couldn't do anything about it. So I made sure you couldn't forget." I stood there, absorbing his words, feeling the weight of something I hadn't considered. "You could have just told me," I said after a long silence. "Would you have listened?" I didn't have an answer. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, he sighed. "I'll take down some of the lights. Not all of them, but enough. And I won't put the mirrors back up." Tom nodded. It wasn't exactly peace, but maybe it was the closest we were going to get. That night, for the first time in months, I slept without waking up in the middle of the night, without checking the windows. And when I stepped outside the next morning, the street felt different. Lighter. Not in a way that could be measured, but in a way that mattered. The war was over.